Greetings, I'm Shad, and there is this idea that is spread in movies, video games, and TV series that are based in either a medieval period or medieval-like fantasy setting, that there are certain weapons more appropriate for women than men. Have a look. You often find in these movies and TV shows and such that if there is a weapon that a woman needs to use, it's often a bow. Swords, it's funny, it's actually a bit of give and take. Sometimes they have no problem and women are using whatever weapon the same that men use, but in other cases you'll find that they often picking up weapons that are supposed to be lighter than other weapons, and they misunderstand this because they give them a rapier. Well, first of all, this concept needs clarification. Now, in a broad sense, everyone knows that the average man is stronger than the average woman, but that's in a broad sense. There are exceptions to that. You can have women that are far stronger than the average man, and you can have a guy that is far weaker than the average woman. Now, in regards to the picture references I've just given, that's referring to the characters, not the actors, okay? I don't know how weak or strong the actors are, but the characters they are portraying are represented to have certain levels of strength that are quite evident in the TV show or film that they come from. So really, the better way to phrase this question is, are there certain weapons that are better suited for people, regardless of sex, that have less physical strength than what the average warrior is represented or shown to have, whether this is in a historical setting or a fantasy world? And yes, I do think there are certain weapons that are better options for someone to pick who has less physical strength than other people. What are those weapons? Because like I mentioned before, movies and TV shows will represent or show that it's the bow or the rapier. And to clarify again, kind of like I mentioned before, the rapier is not so much in film. I actually find that more in video games and such like that. When I really look at movies and the type of swords that are given to people who are supposed to have less strength than the average person, and oftentimes it is women. In regards to melee weapons, it's anything. It can be a sword, long sword, other things like that, but more often than not, they will give them a bow over a melee weapon. But if they do have a melee weapon, yeah, whatever will work. Still, there is the idea that the rapier is a lighter weapon, better suited for people with less strength. If you're a rogue, it's faster and more whippy, so you will see rogues or thieves using rapiers more often than you will see a knight. Well, these two things can be understood far more, okay? The idea that the rapier is light is bullcrap. It's about as heavy as a normal arming sword. But let's look at the bow. The first thing is, if you are a person with less physical strength, the bow might be a good pick. There needs to be a caveat kind of mentioned here, because it's a misconception to think that you can use a bow as effectively as someone else if you are physically weaker than the average person. This will all come down into the draw weight of the bow, how much force it is required to actually pull the bow back to full draw, because you could get a custom bow that requires less strength to pull back than the average bow. The issue then is that it won't fire as far or have nearly as much force as the average bow. And in movies and stuff like that, the bows that you're seeing, you know, these warriors, and whether they're a guy or girl, the bows you're seeing them using, well, of course they're props, okay? They have no real draw strength at all. They're made to be flimsy and weak so they can just get the shot and show, and they'll put in a digital arrow, usually. Well, in reality, depending on the type of bow, it can require massive amounts of strength to pull back, especially if you're looking at English longbow. In that regard, the concept or idea that the bow is a weapon better suited for people with less physical strength is absolute bull. That type of weapon is a weapon that requires more strength than what the average person has, and you actually have to practice and work out the exact specific kind of muscles you're using to get this huge kind of bow, then, you know, to shoot it. So yes, let us blow that myth out of the water. There is context, of course, because like I mentioned, it depends on the type of bow. But if you want a bow that can shoot a decent length and have good penetration and strength behind it, you will need it to be of at least moderate draw strength on it, all right? And in those cases, the bow is not a very good pick for someone with less strength. And the other thing that the movies get wrong is holding the bow back at full draw. And they just do it casually, like, yeah, you know, I'm aiming, or I'm having a conversation with you and I'm just holding this, you know, bow back that can be anything from 60 to 100 pounds of force that I'm holding back. I went to an archery blog to try and find out how long the average archer can hold back a bow at full draw. And I found it was very varying on how long they can hold it back. And it ranged from 5 seconds to about 20 seconds, and only very few could say, oh, I can hold it back for 30 seconds. But gee, that would be an effort in my opinion. Because again, it depends on the weight of the bow they're holding back. But still, okay, we're not talking about minutes, we're talking about seconds. 5 seconds to the max being around 30 seconds. So we can assume the average lies somewhere in between, and the 30-second was more of an exception than the common. The common high one was really 20 seconds, so I would say the average is between 10 and 15 seconds maximum draw, length of time that you can hold it for. Having said all this, okay, if you are someone with less physical strength than many of the warriors you're going to be facing, which puts you at a disadvantage, there is a good bit of logic in this idea of using a bow, and that's the fact that you're using ranged weaponry, because if you're fighting people who are stronger, and strength is more of a significant factor in fighting than you might assume. And if you are physically weaker, it puts you at a huge disadvantage. So going into one-on-one melee combat might not be the best idea. Sticking back in range combat, that can be a good tactic for these type of people. So if you do want to stick back and use ranged weapons, well, we come into the issues about the bow and what level of, draw weight are we talking about. But there is another weapon that takes away the issue of draw weight completely, and it's the crossbow. The draw weight on crossbows get to such ridiculous levels that even strong people can't pull them back, which is why they have inbuilt loading assists, loading mechanisms to help draw these, the strings back and ready to fire. They can either have like a full leather kind of thing that will help pull it back, or a full-fledged winch. And so in my opinion, the best ranged weapon for someone to pick who has less physical strength than other people would be crossbow. Not bow, crossbow. What about melee weapons? Because, like I have mentioned, movies oftentimes, they either don't care. They will give people who are supposed to have less physical strength than other people the same weapons, any weapon, whatever, all right? Or if they do feel, we should give them a weapon that's better suited for their strength level, it will generally be the rapier. So they either don't care or they care too much and pick the wrong weapon because the rapier isn't light. It's as heavy as a normal arming sword. Well, is there a weapon that is better suited for people with less physical strength? And we're talking about melee weapons specifically. I do feel there is. And it might not be what you think. It's the longsword. And when I say longsword, I'm talking about the medieval, standard, classic, two-handed sword. What? But the longsword is two-handed. It's heavier than other swords. Well, this is the thing, okay? If your arms have equivalent strength as each other, you should be able to lift twice as much weight with two hands than you can with one. The thing is, the average longsword does not weigh twice as much as the average one-handed sword, and we'll talk about the arming sword. In fact, on average, the longsword only weighs around 50% more than the arming sword. The arming sword average weight, about 1 kilo, 1 to 1.2 kilos. Average longsword weight, 1.5 to 1.7 kilos, and again, it always depends on the type of sword, but that's it. And so the longsword is not twice as heavy as an arming sword, but if you could effectively lift twice as much weight with two hands than you can with one, that would mean this weapon, when you use with two hands, will feel lighter for you than if you were holding a one-handed sword. And that's just the basic logic behind it, but in application it's exactly the same. I prefer the longsword. I'm not particularly fit, so I tire quickly when I'm using a one-handed sword because they feel heavier in my hand. But as soon as I get two hands, so it's a different ball game completely. And I can adopt stances that, keep my sword at rest to conserve my energy, and I find these swords far easier to use than one-handed swords. Now, there are other things that make the longsword very well suited for someone who has less physical strength than other people. One, it's better balanced, and the point of balance is closer to the handle, which means they take less energy to use, to accelerate, to manipulate. An axe is top-heavy, so if you're using an axe, you have to hold it like that, but generally, an axe will be more tiresome to use than a weapon that is far better balanced, like a longsword. Now, there are other weapons that could be quite useful, like a spear, or other types of pole arms. And yes, they have the advantage of being two-handed as well, so they could work quite well if you are lacking in physical strength compared to the average warrior that you face. But in regards to what's better, these spears or pole arms or long swords, well, that all depends on context and the standard arguments. Taking away strength out of the picture, what is just better, these pole arms or, long swords? Generally, you'll find that polearms are better on battlefields, but longswords are far better for self-defense. And there you have it. Those are my thoughts on what weapons are best for someone who has less physical strength than the average warrior that they will be facing. For ranged, crossbow, for melee, depending on what you're going to fight, probably a polearm or a longsword. Thank you for watching. I do want to hear your thoughts on this subject in question. Please share them in the comments below, and until next time, farewell.